I want to talk about the limits of sexual ethics within the ministry. The limits of sexual ethics within the ministry, because, and I might touch on a couple other things, but just looking at the NKJV for now, 1 Timothy 3, 1 to 7. This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop must then be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into the reproach and the snare of the devil. So, there's a lot of things going on with this guy to put him into the role of a pastor. Okay. And a guy like this doesn't get molded overnight. Nor does a guy like this get molded by himself, right? He gets molded in a community, a church that is Bible-based, okay? So he is the product of the community. He doesn't, you don't get like this all by yourself, okay? Now, a person on their own can attain a level of sanctification if they, separate themselves from worldly people and give themselves over to Bible study. And they can get pretty far with that, I think. But you don't get this far in sanctification unless you're in a church community that is all in on, like maybe some Lordship Salvation type Baptist church, and is really, really committed to sanctification, Bible-based sanctification and study. So one of these people is going to come out from the group and is going to be identified as having all these characteristics, okay? And this person, that's how you know he's the guy. He's the guy to be burdened with the task of being the pastor. Of course, being a pastor is not just teaching on Sunday. It's what the public appearance of him is. But it's all the other stuff. It's the counseling. It's all the other little activities related to teaching and the nurture of souls. So, you see, people wrongly think that a pastor is just a preacher, and that's all he is just a public speaker. That is not correct. He's a counselor. He's a visitation guy. He marries people. He buries people. He's not just a preacher. If you're thinking, oh, well, I'm called to preach, that might mean that you're called to be an evangelist, but not necessarily a pastor. A pastor has to have all these qualifications. These are social qualifications to be able to hold a community together. A lot of qualifications here. First thing is he has to be the husband of one wife, not divorced and remarried to a second wife. Okay? The husband of one wife. Temperate, self-controlled, sober-minded, good behavior, hospitable. He's nice. He brings people over to his house. He's able to teach the Bible. He's not a wino. He's not a violent man. He doesn't get into fist fights. He's not greedy for money. He's a gentle, not an argumentative person. He's not greedy. And he also is a good family man. He runs his house well. His kids respect him, and not by coercion or anything like that. He's not prideful. He's not prideful like the devil was when he fell. And he's not a brand new Christian. Right, and he has a good reputation with people. So it's all sorts of this stuff is created in the community of the church, the Bible-based Baptist church, where everybody's, committed to the Reformed view of sanctification, essentially. This guy gets pulled out from among them. But what about evangelists? Evangelists are not pastors. Okay. Evangelists are not pastors. They are traveling preachers. And we definitely have traveling preachers in the Bible that are not pastors. Peter was not a pastor that we know of, although some people say he was the pastor of the Church of Rome, and that eventually led to the formation of the Catholic Church. I don't know. But the Apostle Paul was not a pastor. He was an evangelist. Barnabas was not a pastor. He was an evangelist. Most of the disciples were not pastors. They were just evangelists. They traveled around, and they were traveling preachers. They visited synagogues, and they spread the gospel message. So a pastor is another kind of animal. If we were to use biblical symbolism, I suppose an evangelist could be represented by an eagle, because he can see into the realm of the spirit, and he travels around with his wings, But a pastor probably is more to be characterized as a sheepdog, right? He's not a dumb dog that cannot bark at his sheep. He will bark at them to keep them in the right spot, and he will bark at the wolves if they come to attack the flock. So I would say that a pastor is essentially a sheepdog, but an evangelist is probably more to be typified by an eagle, somebody who kind of flies around from church to church, from pastor to pastor. And both of these types of preachers are needed in the church, because the evangelists are people who they have a one-track mind. Like, all they can practically bring themselves to think about is hell, and getting people saved from it. So evangelists are kind of, they're just really just, they can't, it's very difficult for evangelists to think about anything else when it comes to the Christian life. Pastors are a lot more multifaceted in their orientation towards preaching topics, and so they're going to preach on all sorts of things, and it's going to come out of their social relationships in the church. So I think that both of these are needed, but you'll find that the evangelist might not have all of the qualities and the character traits of a pastor. And sometimes evangelists tend to not be as gentle as pastors, because they're not around people as much. And so sometimes I think evangelists can sometimes be kind of quarrelsome, and that's something they need to work on. And as you may know, that there are always going to be false evangelists who are greedy for money, and those types of guys are spoken of in, I think it's either 2 Peter or Jude, or there's like a parallel passage where Jude and 2 Peter are almost completely parallel. It's talking about false evangelists that are just greedy for people's money, like Elmer Gantry, and they're sexually immoral. But I also want to say this. After all that I've said here, we've got discernment ministries like Justin Peters today, which are, I think, really useful. We've got people like Julie Roys, and these are really useful, I think. These are people that really have burdens from the Lord. But then we've got copycat ministries out there, and I don't need to name them, which are just, I believe, sometimes backslidden people who just delight in digging up dirt on people, like a supermarket tabloid. And they're not encouraging people towards the gospel. They're not encouraging people towards walking with the Lord. They're just angry at the church. Right? They don't have any desire to fulfill the Great Commission. right? So those types of people, you need to be like, dude, take what they say with a grain of salt, right? God calls us to fulfill the Great Commission. And we also live in a really fallen world. We don't live in a perfect world. And even the pastor, with the qualifications, everything's so perfect here in 1 Timothy 3. Even such a man is not absolutely in a state of sinless perfectionism. Now notice that the first qualification in 1 Timothy 3:2 is the husband of one wife. He's the husband of one wife. I think that's because it's the most important qualification, right? So that rules out every Catholic priest, okay, because they believe you have to be celibate, right? There's a sanctifying element that comes into a person's life when he becomes married, okay? And so if he can be temperate and the husband of one wife at the same time, that's a rare bird. That's a rare bird right there. So he's the husband of one wife. That's the first qualification, all right? He's not somebody who has committed physical adultery with another woman, all right? No, people can backslide. People can have low points. People can have difficulties in their marriage, and they unzip their emotions to people, to members of the opposite sex at church or at work, and it's wrong, and it happens. And that should be heavily discouraged, that sort of thing. The Billy Graham rule was developed by Billy Graham as a method of allowing, of saying, don't unzip your emotions to other members of the opposite sex. I don't care if things are going rough with you in your marriage or whatever. Don't ever do that. That does not please the Lord. And so that was one of the things about Billy Graham's Billy Graham rule, is that he made this distinction that you should never be alone with a woman that's not your wife, ever, under any circumstances. That's a good rule, but I think it would be wise to go further than that and to say you should never be alone with a woman communicating with her back and forth in a manner in which it's not related to your professional life, or in a manner in which it is disclosing the emotions of your heart in some sort of a vulnerable way, in some sort of a complaining way. Okay, that is such a... So, although that could be called emotional adultery, okay, that's not described, okay, in 1 Timothy 3:2, and it could be easily overlooked, okay, because we're always waiting for that really dramatic moment where the person actually commits a physical act of adultery to start thinking about 1 Timothy 3:2. But no, I think it's better. Now I might say, well, that's a Jewish Mishnah. You just put an extra biblical rule around 1 Timothy 3:2 to guard it. Well, I think you might say, well, how can a pastor do his job if he can't talk to women at church? That whole line of thinking begs the question of, and now what? I mean, does the pastor's wife might not be on payroll, but why can't she talk to the women in the church? You know? But here's another thing. People backslide, man. People backslide. Even people who love the Lord backslide. And it doesn't matter if you're charismatic, Baptist, Arminian, or Pentecostal. People of all types and classes backslide. So, but how much backsliding is to be tolerated in the Christian life? How much backsliding is to be tolerated in the ministry? And then at what point do we say, okay, this is too much backsliding. You should never be in ministry ever again. Shut down your ministry. Close up shop. You should never be in ministry ever again. Well, I think the first thing, we should really be seriously looking at 1 Timothy 3 here. The husband of one wife. It is a serious transgression if a preacher is physically involved with a woman that's not his wife. So if a person thinks after he's done something like that, if a person goes on thinking that God has called him to the ministry after doing something like that, I think he's deceived. Because it says in 1 Timothy 3:2, the husband of one wife. If you've physically done something that only a wife is deserving of to another woman, you've broken the marriage contract, in my opinion. Now you might say, well, I had a hard time with my wife some years back, and I communicated with other women, but I never got physical with them. Well, you weren't unfaithful, but you could definitely be put in the category of maybe you need to sit on the sidelines for a while and not be in the spotlight and really contemplate your relationship with God. But I truly believe that 1 Timothy 3:2 is mainly a warning to preachers to never get sexually involved. Never get physically involved with another woman other than your wife. I think that is certainly the straw that breaks the camel's back. There's a lot of other side trails I can go into for now. You could look at the book of Jude, or I think it's 2 Peter. Let me take a look. Why don't I do that? Let's take a look at 2 Peter. Second Peter 2, I believe it is. Yep. This is a parallel passage. 2 Peter 2 is a parallel passage, almost word for word, for the book of Jude in some spots. I think Jude must have copied him in some spots here. I'm going to read the whole thing, 2 Peter 2. There were also false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, and bring on themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their destructive ways, because of whom the way of truth will be blasphemed. By covetousness they will exploit you with deceptive words. For a long time their judgment has not been idle, and their destruction does not slumber. So a false teacher that needs to be removed from the pulpit is a person who uses deceiving words in order to exploit your money. That's a huge, and that's clearly the case with prosperity gospel preachers. The Word of Faith camp really need to be seriously thinking about 2 Peter 2 in those cases. Okay, in the doom of false teachers, 2 Peter 2:4, if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations, and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment, and especially those who walk according to the flesh in the lust of uncleanness, and despise authority. What's the lust of uncleanness? Sexual immorality. Actual physical sexual immorality. They are presumptuous, self-willed. They are not afraid to speak evil of dignitaries, whereas angels, who are greater in power and might, do not bring a reviling accusation against them before the Lord. Okay, dignitaries is talking about either angels or demons or both. Okay, so these are naturalistic people who do not have supernatural worldviews. They're prideful, they're presumptuous, they're self-willed, and they're sexually immoral, and they're still teaching in the body of Christ. And they have anti-supernatural remarks that they make about the spirit realm. Okay. And these, like natural brute beasts made to be caught and destroyed, speak evil of the things they do not understand, and will utterly perish in their own corruption, and will receive the wages of unrighteousness, as those who count it pleasure to carouse in the daytime. They are spots and blemishes, carousing in their own deceptions while they feast with you, having eyes full of adultery, and that cannot cease from sin, enticing unstable souls. They have a heart trained in covetous practices, and are accursed children. They have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. But he was rebuked for his iniquity. A dumb donkey speaking with a man's voice restrained the madness of the prophet. Sexual immorality, greed, these are the marks of a false teacher. When we talk about sexual immorality, we're talking about actual physical acts of adultery. We're not talking about lustful thoughts, lustful feelings, or anything else that you might call into the category of sexual sin on the emotional level. We're talking about actual physical, actual adultery, and people being exploited, like Rodney Howard-Browne selling a $500 Bible on his ministry website. I mean, come on. Come on, man. Verse 17, 2 Peter 2:17, these are wells without water, clouds carried by a tempest, for whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. Deceptions of false teachers. 2 Peter 2:18, for when they speak great swelling words of emptiness, they allure through the lusts of the flesh, through lewdness, the ones who have actually escaped from those who live in error. While they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption. For by whom a person is overcome, by him also he is brought into bondage. So liberty. They're all about cheap grace, hyper grace, easy believism, but bondage to sexual sin, nevertheless, is the ultimate ulterior motive. For if, after they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled in them and overcome, the latter end is worse for them than the beginning. For it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness, the gospel, in other words, than having known it, to turn from the holy commandment delivered to them. In other words, don't live in sexual immorality. It's part of the gospel. That's in Matthew 5. But it has happened to them according to the true proverb, a dog returns to his own vomit, and his sow having washed to her wallowing in the mire. So the biggest thing is sexual immorality. Clearly, it's mentioned 3 or 4, maybe even 5 or 6 times in this passage. That's the biggest thing, man. Sexual immorality, actual physical acts of sexual immorality found among false teachers. 2 Peter 2, that's where you say this person should never sit in the pulpit again. Sure, they can be redeemed before the Lord in their private lives, but they should not, if they're trying to operate a ministry, whether it's charismatic or evangelical, no, you should not give them your pulpit if they have been found guilty of a physical act of sexual immorality. Absolutely not. People can backslide, dude. Both charismatics and evangelicals can backslide. They can do things under temptation and communicate with members of the opposite sex that are just wrong. And because they're having problems in their marriage. But if it ever gets to the point, listen to this, if it ever gets to the point of actual physical sexual immorality, fornication, or adultery, no, that person is not allowed, according to Scripture, according to 2 Peter 2, that person is not allowed to be a preacher ever again. Also, covetousness is mentioned very much. These two things go together, sexual greed and financial greed. When you have these two things going on, that person's not supposed to be a preacher. You're not supposed to allow him. Why are they being identified? Because the main concern is evangelists. People who are traveling around from synagogue to synagogue, from house church to house church. And pastors need to know what to look for when it comes to traveling speakers. Okay? That's why it's really important even to name them. So that if you have a traveling speaker who your church wants to invite as pastor, you should say, no, that person's been, Todd Bentley, he's been identified as a person involved in a physical act of sexual immorality. No, according to 2 Peter 2, no, he's not going to be allowed into this pulpit. That's why this is written. That's why this is written. 2 Peter 2 and Jude was written to say, look, at what point do our sexual ethics reach a limit? Okay, this is when you know. This is when you know. Preachers that actually physically get involved in sexual immorality, like Chris Reed, physically get involved, okay? They're not allowed to be preachers anymore. Tolerance, grace, and mercy can be showed to other shades and grades of impropriety among preachers, but that is not tolerated. Stephen J. Lawson, one physical act of adultery. No, you can't be a preacher anymore, dude. Sorry. You blew it. You blew it. You blew the Great Commission. I'm sorry. You blew it. So, stay away from women, dude. That's stay away from women. Like, it is such a trap of the devil, man. Such a trap. God bless out there. This is John with WesleyGospel.com.